When a qualified black woman walks into an interview for her dream role, she's met with mockery and dismissal from a smug manager who sees only her accent and not her talent. But what he doesn't realize is that she's about to become his new boss and expose his toxic leadership for all to see. This is a story of resilience, justice, and the power of true leadership. Naomi Carter adjusted the strap of her leather bag and straightened her navy blazer as she stepped into the gleaming lobby of Titan Corp's headquarters. The polished marble floors and towering glass walls exuded modernity and success, but there was a chill in the air that had little to do with the central air conditioning. She approached the receptionist, a young woman with a rehearsed smile, who barely glanced at Naomi before directing her to the 25th floor. As the elevator ascended, Naomi took a deep breath, her nerves steadying. She had prepared for this interview meticulously. Her years of experience in corporate strategy, coupled with her advanced degree from an Ivy League institution, made her a top candidate for the Vice President of Operations role. She was more than qualified, and she knew it. The elevator doors opened to reveal an equally sleek floor, bathed in natural light and lined with minimalist decor. Naomi strode toward the glass-walled conference room where her interviewer was waiting. Inside sat Richard Myers, the hiring manager, a man whose tailored suit and perfectly styled hair seemed as polished as the office itself. Richard looked up as Naomi entered, and the faintest flicker of surprise crossed his face before it was replaced by a tight-lipped smile. He stood, extending a hand, but his posture remained rigid, and his handshake was fleeting. "Ms. Carter, is it?" he said, his tone clipped. "Yes, thank you for meeting with me," Naomi replied, her voice calm and steady, carrying the soft lilt of her Caribbean heritage. Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly at her accent, and a smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Right, let's get started," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Naomi took her seat, her back straight and her hands folded neatly over her portfolio. She began by summarizing her experience, speaking with poise and clarity. She highlighted her leadership roles, the strategic initiatives she had spearheaded, and the measurable successes she had achieved. But as Naomi spoke, Richard's demeanor shifted. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing with barely concealed skepticism. "Impressive," he said after a pause that stretched just long enough to feel dismissive. "But it seems like most of your experience has been, let's say, regional. Have you had exposure to managing operations on a global scale?" "Yes, actually," Naomi replied smoothly. "In my previous role, I oversaw operations across 3 continents, coordinating teams in Europe, Asia, and North America." Richard gave a slow nod, his lips pursed. And your accent. Do you find that it ever poses challenges in communicating with diverse teams?" Naomi's grip on her portfolio tightened for a fraction of a second before she responded. "Not at all. In fact, my ability to connect with diverse teams has been one of my strengths. Effective communication goes beyond accents. It's about understanding and collaboration." Richard chuckled lightly, though it lacked warmth. "Of course. It's just that in roles like this, we often need someone who can really command the room. You know what I mean?" "I do," Naomi said firmly, her tone unyielding. "And I've consistently done that in every role I've held." The tension in the room grew thicker as the interview progressed. Richard's questions became increasingly pointed, his tone laced with subtle condescension. He questioned Naomi's ability to adapt to Titan Corp's fast-paced culture and hinted that her background might not align with the company's vision. Each time, Naomi countered with eloquence and professionalism, refusing to let his thinly veiled biases rattle her. By the end of the interview, Richard closed her file with a loud snap and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Well, Ms. Carter," he said, his smile sharp and insincere. "You've certainly got something, but I'm afraid we're looking for someone with a bit more polish. Thanks for coming in." Naomi's heart tightened, but she refused to show it. Rising from her chair, she extended her hand. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Myers," she said, her voice steady, though her jaw was set. As she walked out of the conference room, Richard leaned back in his chair, smirking as he muttered under his breath, "What were they thinking sending her here?" Naomi stepped into the elevator, her shoulders squared and her head held high. She wouldn't let Richard's ignorance define her worth. But as the elevator descended, she couldn't shake the sting of being underestimated yet again. What Richard didn't know, however, was that Naomi Carter's journey with Titan Corp wasn't over. And the next time their paths crossed, it would be on very different terms. Richard Myers leaned back in his office chair, a smug grin spreading across his face as he addressed the small group gathered in his corner office. The large windows behind him framed a sprawling view of the city skyline, a sight he often associated with his own sense of accomplishment and authority. Today, however, he was reveling in something far less commendable. "Well, that was a waste of time," Richard said, chuckling as he straightened his cufflinks. "I just wrapped up the strangest interview. She thought she was qualified for vice president of operations. Can you believe that?" One of his colleagues, a young junior manager eager to curry favor, tilted his head. "Who was it?" Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Some woman with a thick accent, Caribbean maybe. Honestly, it was hard to tell, but she was completely out of her depth. I don't even know how her resume got through the first round." The group exchanged knowing glances, their polite smiles masking the unease some of them felt. Richard was known for his sharp tongue and even sharper biases, but few dared to challenge him directly. "I mean," Richard continued, leaning forward now, "can you imagine putting someone like that in charge of global operations? Half the team wouldn't even understand her. It's hard to inspire confidence when you sound like you're running a resort instead of a Fortune 500 company." The room erupted into forced laughter, though a few faces in the group stiffened. One senior team member, Claire Roberts, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "She must have had some qualifications to get this far," Claire said, her tone measured. Richard's smirk faltered for a moment before returning with a vengeance. "Oh, sure, her resume was polished enough, but qualifications aren't everything, Claire. It's about presence, polish, and, well, fitting the image of the company." His voice lowered conspiratorially. "Let's just say she didn't quite check all those boxes." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing further. She had learned long ago that challenging Richard openly rarely led to productive outcomes. Meanwhile, Naomi Carter stepped out of the building into the warm afternoon sun, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. The sting of the interview lingered, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. With each step she took, she reminded herself of the strength she had built over the years, the resilience she had honed in the face of adversity. She paused at the edge of the busy sidewalk, pulling her phone from her bag. A notification caught her eye. A message from an old mentor wishing her luck with the interview. Naomi smiled faintly, her resolve strengthening. The city around her buzzed with energy, but Naomi felt a calm determination settling over her. Richard's condescension was nothing new. She had faced men like him before, men who couldn't see past their narrow perceptions to recognize true talent. And she knew that her worth wasn't dictated by the biases of one small-minded man. Naomi adjusted her blazer, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the subway station. She wouldn't waste another moment dwelling on Richard Myers. She had bigger plans in motion. Back in the office, Richard poured himself a cup of coffee, still basking in his own self-importance. "It's really something," he mused aloud, speaking more to himself than anyone else. "The audacity of some people, thinking they can just walk in here and grab a corner office." His junior colleague laughed nervously. "Well, at least you didn't waste too much time on her." "Exactly," Richard replied, smirking. "I could tell within 5 minutes she wasn't Titan Corp material. We're talking about someone who probably grew up playing steel drums on a beach. Not exactly the pedigree we look for." The casual cruelty of the remark hung in the air, but no one dared to call him out. Even Claire, who had bristled earlier, remained silent, though her clenched jaw betrayed her frustration. Richard thrived on this kind of unchecked authority. He prided himself on his ability to spot winners and dismiss anyone who didn't meet his narrow, often superficial criteria. He didn't see himself as prejudiced, of course, just discerning. "She might be great at running a charity," Richard added, swirling his coffee. "But Titan Corp? No chance." As Richard sat in his glass-walled office, secure in his arrogance, Naomi was already moving forward. She boarded the subway, the hum of the train grounding her as she reflected on the day. She thought about Richard's smirk, his thinly veiled disdain, and the way he had dismissed her accent as if it defined her abilities. And then she thought about the years she had spent proving people like him wrong. Naomi's path hadn't been easy, but it had been purposeful. She had worked tirelessly to climb the ranks in her field, building a reputation as a strategic visionary and a compassionate leader. Her accent wasn't a hindrance. It was a part of her identity, a reflection of the rich culture and history that had shaped her into the person she was today. As the train rocked gently, Naomi allowed herself a small smile. Richard Myers had underestimated her, just like so many others had before. But he didn't know what was coming. Because Naomi Carter wasn't just another candidate, she was about to become his boss. The bustling energy of Titan Corp's office was amplified by the unexpected company-wide email that had landed in everyone's inbox that morning. The subject line, "Mandatory all-hands meeting, boardroom 3 p.m., had set off a wave of speculation. Employees huddled near their desks, whispering about potential mergers, new projects, or even layoffs. Richard Myers, however, strode toward the boardroom with his usual air of confidence, flashing his signature smirk at passing colleagues. "Big news coming," he mused aloud, nudging a junior manager. "It's probably about that expansion deal I helped close last quarter. Wouldn't be surprised if they're rolling out the red carpet for me." The boardroom was a spacious, glass-walled chamber at the heart of the office, reserved for only the most important announcements. As employees began filing in, Richard took his seat near the center, ensuring he had the best view of the proceedings. The chatter around him grew louder, fueled by excitement and curiosity. At precisely 3 p.m., the CEO, Howard Livingston, entered the room. A seasoned executive with silver hair and a commanding presence, Howard was known for his no-nonsense approach and sharp business acumen. The room fell silent as he walked to the front, flanked by several board members. Howard cleared his throat and surveyed the room, his expression serious but tinged with enthusiasm. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on such short notice. I won't keep you in suspense. We're here to announce a major leadership appointment." The buzz in the room returned instantly, with whispers rippling across the rows of employees. Richard leaned back in his chair, a self-assured grin spreading across his face. His mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps a new role for me? VP of Global Strategy, maybe? Howard continued, "Titan Corp is entering a new phase of growth, and with that comes the need for visionary leadership. After an extensive search and careful deliberation, we're thrilled to introduce our new Vice President of Operations." The CEO stepped aside, gesturing toward the doorway. The sound of confident footsteps echoed through the boardroom as a figure appeared. Naomi Carter entered, poised and graceful, her tailored navy blue suit and white silk blouse exuding both authority and elegance. Her textured hair was styled neatly, and her warm hazel eyes scanned the room with calm confidence. For a moment, the room was frozen in stunned silence. Then, the whispers started. Soft murmurs of recognition and surprise as employees put the pieces together. Naomi stood tall at the front of the room, her demeanor professional yet commanding. At the center of it all, Richard Myers felt as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. His smug grin vanished, replaced by an expression of disbelief so stark it could have been captured as a meme. His mind raced, replaying the dismissive remarks he had made during her interview. This can't be right," he muttered under his breath, his hands tightening around the edge of the table. Howard, oblivious to, or perhaps delighting in, the tension, continued speaking. "Naomi Carter brings with her years of experience in global operations, an Ivy League education, and a proven track record of driving success in every role she's held. She's the ideal leader to help us navigate this next chapter." Richard's chest tightened as Howard turned toward Naomi with a warm smile. "Naomi, would you like to say a few words?" Naomi stepped forward, her calm gaze sweeping across the room before landing briefly on Richard. She gave no indication of recognition, though the subtle arch of her brow suggested she hadn't forgotten their previous interaction. "Thank you, Howard," she began, her voice steady and assured, carrying the soft lilt of her Caribbean accent. "It's an honor to join Titan Corp and to work alongside such a talented team. I'm excited to bring my experience to the table and collaborate with all of you to achieve great things." Her words were professional and measured, but the room was electric. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, the realization of Richard's earlier dismissal now fully sinking in. As Naomi concluded her brief remarks, the room erupted into polite applause. Richard clapped mechanically, his movements stiff and robotic. His mind was a whirl of panic, humiliation, and fear. She's my boss. She's going to oversee my department. How did I let this happen? Howard wrapped up the meeting with a few logistical announcements, but the employees were too distracted to pay much attention. As people filed out of the boardroom, many whispered about Naomi's impressive entrance and Richard's visible discomfort. Richard remained seated, staring blankly at the table in front of him. The same woman he had mocked, dismissed, and rejected was now his superior. His carefully crafted image of control and authority was unraveling, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. Naomi, meanwhile, walked out of the boardroom with quiet confidence, her head held high. She didn't need to say anything to Richard. The power dynamic had already shifted, and she knew her actions would speak louder than words. The morning sunlight streamed through the massive glass windows of Titan Corp's headquarters, casting long shadows across the marble floors as employees buzzed with anticipation. Naomi Carter's first day as vice president of operations was all anyone could talk about. Whispers of admiration for her impressive credentials mixed with curious speculation about how she would handle her new role. At precisely 9 a.m., Naomi stepped out of the elevator and into the executive wing. Her tailored navy blue suit exuded authority, and her calm, composed demeanor silenced the few remaining murmurs in the hallways. Employees straightened their postures and offered polite greetings, their respect evident in their expressions. Naomi returned their smiles warmly, but kept her pace steady, her focus unbroken. In the operations department, Richard Myers sat at his desk, his hands fidgeting with a pen. His usual confidence had been replaced by unease. The humiliation of the all-hands meeting still lingered, and the thought of Naomi stepping into his department as his superior was enough to make his stomach churn. When she finally appeared at the door, her presence was both commanding and disarming. "Good morning, Mr. Myers," Naomi said, her voice measured and polite. "I hope you had a productive weekend." Richard forced a tight smile. "Good morning, Ms. Carter. Yes, of course. Very productive," he lied, the words sounding hollow even to himself. Naomi's expression remained professional, but there was a glint in her eye that Richard couldn't quite read. "That's good to hear," she replied. "I'm looking forward to getting a deeper understanding of the department's operations. Shall we begin?" Richard nodded stiffly, gesturing toward the conference room. As the departmental review got underway, the tension in the room was palpable. Naomi sat at the head of the table, her posture confident but approachable. Richard and his team presented a series of reports and metrics, carefully curated to paint a favorable picture of their performance. But Naomi wasn't one to be swayed by surface-level presentations. She listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes or asking pointed questions that exposed gaps in the data. "Mr. Myers," she said, turning to Richard, "I noticed that the quarterly expense report lists significant overspending in the logistics division. Could you elaborate on the decision-making process behind those expenditures?" Richard's throat tightened. "Well, those were necessary adjustments to accommodate unexpected supply chain disruptions," he said hastily. Naomi nodded thoughtfully. "I see. However, based on the market analysis, those disruptions were anticipated weeks in advance. Was there a contingency plan in place to mitigate the costs?" Richard's face flushed, and he stumbled over his words. We were in the process of developing one, but the situation escalated before we could implement it." Naomi's gaze remained steady, but there was no mistaking the undertone of authority in her voice. "Understood. In the future, I'd like to see more proactive planning to avoid similar issues. Let's schedule a meeting next week to discuss contingency strategies in detail." Around the table, Richard's colleagues exchanged subtle glances. Naomi's approach was incisive yet constructive, highlighting inefficiencies without assigning unnecessary blame. But for Richard, each pointed question felt like a direct challenge to his competence. By the end of the review, Richard's nerves were frayed. He retreated to his office, closing the door with more force than necessary. Naomi's calm authority had left him feeling cornered, his usual tactics of bluster and charm rendered useless against her measured professionalism. He slumped into his chair, his mind racing. She's trying to undermine me, he thought bitterly. She's making me look incompetent in front of my own team. Richard's frustration quickly morphed into determination. He needed a plan, a way to reclaim his authority and discredit Naomi before she could establish herself too firmly. Pulling out his phone, Richard began scrolling through his contacts, stopping at the name of a senior executive he had worked with on a previous project. The man had a reputation for valuing loyalty over merit, and Richard knew he could count on him to sow seeds of doubt about Naomi's leadership. Within minutes, Richard was on the phone, his tone casual but laced with subtle manipulation. "Hey, just wanted to give you a heads up about the new VP," he began. "She's sharp, sure, but I'm not convinced she fully understands the company culture yet. There have already been a few hiccups in her approach." His contact listened, nodding along, though his responses were non-committal. Richard leaned back in his chair, satisfied that he had planted the first seeds of his plan. Meanwhile, Naomi returned to her office with a sense of quiet accomplishment. The review had gone as she'd expected. Richard's defensive demeanor and vague answers had confirmed what she already suspected about his management style. Naomi's focus, however, wasn't on dismantling Richard's ego. Her goal was to create a more efficient, inclusive, and collaborative department, one that reflected her values and leadership style. She began drafting an outline for a comprehensive team-building initiative designed to foster better communication and accountability within the department. As she worked, Naomi's mind briefly wandered back to Richard's tight-lipped responses during the review. She could sense his discomfort, but she wasn't interested in playing power games. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle people like Richard was to let her actions speak for themselves. And in this game of resilience and leadership, Naomi Carter had every intention of winning. Naomi Carter sat at her desk late one evening, her office illuminated by the soft glow of her desk lamp. A stack of documents sat neatly before her, each sheet containing fragments of a troubling pattern she had begun to uncover. Over the past few weeks, her observations of Richard Meyer's management style had raised red flags, discrepancies in budgets, unusually high employee turnover in his department, and whispers of hiring decisions that didn't align with company policies. Naomi's instincts told her there was more beneath the surface, and her instincts were rarely wrong. She began her investigation discreetly, combing through departmental records, expense reports, and performance reviews. What she found was worse than she had anticipated. Richard's hiring practices, on paper, appeared to follow company protocols. However, when Naomi cross-referenced applicant data, a clear pattern emerged. Promising candidates from diverse backgrounds had been consistently overlooked, their applications marked with vague notes like, "doesn't fit the culture," or "lacks polish." In contrast, less qualified candidates who shared Richard's elitist tendencies had been fast-tracked into roles they were unprepared for, leading to inefficiencies and mistakes. In addition to discriminatory hiring, Naomi uncovered questionable expense reports. Richard had billed the company for extravagant business dinners and personal travel expenses, disguising them as client meetings. The sums weren't enormous individually, but over time they added up to a significant misuse of company resources. Naomi methodically documented everything. She compiled spreadsheets, collected email correspondence, and even interviewed former employees who had left the company due to Richard's toxic leadership. Every detail was meticulously organized, leaving no room for doubt or misinterpretation. When Naomi felt her case was airtight, she scheduled a meeting with the board of directors. The atmosphere in the boardroom that day was tense. Howard Livingston, the CEO, sat at the head of the table, his sharp gaze moving between Naomi and Richard, who had also been summoned to the meeting. Richard sat stiffly, his usual smug demeanor replaced by a thin veneer of confidence. Naomi began her presentation with calm professionalism, her voice steady as she laid out the evidence. "Over the past few weeks, I've conducted a thorough review of our operations department," she said, clicking to the first slide in her presentation. "Unfortunately, my findings reveal a pattern of misconduct that requires immediate attention." The room fell silent as Naomi detailed the issues. She presented data showing how Richard's discriminatory hiring practices had stifled talent and hindered the department's performance. She displayed charts highlighting inefficiencies caused by poor leadership decisions, then moved to the expense reports, showing how company funds had been misused under the guise of business development. Each revelation was met with a mix of disbelief and anger from the board members. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face reddening with each new slide. "Ms. Carter," one of the board members said, his tone serious, "are you confident in the accuracy of this information?" "Absolutely," Naomi replied. She gestured toward a folder on the table. "I've included all supporting documentation in these reports for your review. The evidence is clear and verifiable." Richard finally broke his silence, his voice defensive. "This is absurd. I've been with this company for over a decade, and I've always acted in its best interests." Naomi turned to him, her expression calm but firm. "Then perhaps you can explain why nearly 30% of candidates in your hiring pipeline were rejected for reasons unrelated to their qualifications. Or why expense reports show charges for client dinners that don't align with any scheduled meetings." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but faltered, the weight of the evidence rendering him speechless. Howard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the room. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said finally, his voice measured. "Your diligence and thoroughness in bringing this to our attention are commendable." He turned to Richard, his tone sharpening. "Mr. Myers, this company values integrity above all else. The evidence presented today raises serious concerns about your leadership and conduct." Richard's face drained of color as the board members exchanged murmurs. It was clear that his position was no longer secure. "We will conduct a formal investigation," Howard continued. "But based on the initial findings, I recommend that Mr. Myers be placed on administrative leave effective immediately." The decision was unanimous. As Richard was escorted out of the boardroom, his usual air of superiority had crumbled into a mix of anger and humiliation. When the meeting adjourned, Naomi remained behind, collecting her materials with a quiet sense of accomplishment. She hadn't exposed Richard to settle a score. She had done it to uphold the values she believed in and to ensure that Titan Corp could thrive without the toxic leadership that had held it back. As she walked out of the boardroom, several board members approached her, commending her for her courage and professionalism. Howard gave her a nod of approval. "You've proven yourself to be exactly the kind of leader this company needs, Naomi." She smiled softly, her confidence bolstered not by validation, but by the knowledge that she had done what was right. Richard Myers was gone, his downfall a direct result of his own actions. And under Naomi's leadership, the future of the operations department, and Titan Corp as a whole, looked brighter than ever. The grand conference hall at Titan Corp headquarters buzzed with anticipation. Rows of employees filled the room, their chatter a mix of curiosity and speculation. The stage was set with a sleek podium bearing the company logo, flanked by large screens displaying a single phrase, "Building a better Titan Corp together." Naomi Carter stood behind the curtain, taking a deep, steadying breath. She had prepared for this moment carefully, not just with words, but with conviction. Her role as vice president of operations had already begun to reshape the company, but this speech was her chance to address something deeper, the culture that had allowed bias and exclusion to linger beneath the surface. As the lights dimmed, the room fell silent. A soft spotlight illuminated the podium, and Naomi stepped forward, her navy suit immaculate, her posture poised. Her hazel eyes scanned the room, meeting the gazes of employees who ranged from entry-level interns to senior executives. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady yet warm, carrying the soft lilt of her Caribbean accent. "Thank you for taking the time to be here today. I know you're all busy, but I want to share something that I believe is critical to the success of Titan Corp, not just as a business, but as a community." Naomi paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I've spent my career navigating challenges, both personal and professional. I've worked in environments where I was underestimated because of my accent, my background, or simply because I didn't fit someone else's narrow definition of what leadership should look like." A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience, many nodding in silent understanding. Naomi's voice grew stronger, more resolute. "But each of those challenges taught me something valuable. That resilience, determination, and integrity are more powerful than any bias or stereotype. And it's those lessons that I bring with me to Titan Corp. Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with employees who had faced their own struggles. Diversity, Naomi continued, is not just a buzzword or a box to check. It's a fundamental strength. When we embrace different perspectives, experiences, and voices, we unlock innovation and creativity that wouldn't be possible in a homogeneous environment. She gestured toward the screens, which now displayed statistics on diversity's impact on productivity and revenue growth. The data is clear. Companies that prioritize inclusivity outperform those that don't. But more importantly, they create environments where employees feel valued, respected, and empowered to do their best work. Naomi's tone shifted, becoming more personal. I know what it feels like to be dismissed, to have your ideas overlooked because of how you speak or where you come from. And I know I'm not the only one in this room who has felt that way. Her honesty struck a chord. In the audience, employees exchanged glances, some looking visibly moved. Even a few senior managers who had aligned themselves with Richard Myers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Naomi took a step away from the podium, her voice softening. I want to share a story. One that's not unique to me, but one I know many of you will recognize. It's the story of someone walking into a room, prepared, capable, and qualified, only to be dismissed because of an assumption. It's the story of someone being told they don't fit, or that they're not ready, even when they've proven otherwise. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. These experiences are not just hurtful, they're harmful. They undermine trust, stifle growth, and create a culture of exclusion. And that's why it's so important for us to do better. Although she never mentioned Richard by name, the implication was clear. Those who had witnessed his behavior, or benefited from his favoritism, began to look down, avoiding her gaze. Naomi returned to the podium, her voice now carrying an undercurrent of hope. Change starts with leadership, but it doesn't end there. Each of us has a role to play in building a culture of respect and collaboration. It means calling out biases when we see them. It means advocating for those who might not yet have a voice. And it means recognizing that true strength lies in lifting others up, not tearing them down. The screens shifted again, displaying images of diverse teams working together, accompanied by the words, "Strength in diversity, success in unity." The applause began slowly, but quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. Employees stood, clapping not just for Naomi's words, but for the authenticity and vision behind them. In the days that followed, Naomi's speech became the talk of the company. Employees began reflecting on their own behaviors and biases, spurred by the call to action she had delivered so powerfully. Even Richard Myers' former allies began to distance themselves from him, realizing that his toxic leadership was no longer tolerated. Naomi's right, one manager admitted during a lunch break. We've got to do better. This company can't afford another Richard. For Naomi, the speech wasn't about glory or personal validation. It was about creating lasting change. As she walked through the hallways in the days that followed, employees greeted her with genuine warmth and respect. She saw the seeds of a culture shift beginning to take root, a shift she had helped inspire. Naomi knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but she was ready. She had faced prejudice and condescension before, and she had overcome it. Now, as Titan Corp's leader, she was determined to ensure that no one else would have to fight the same battles alone. Her journey wasn't just a personal victory. It was a message to everyone that resilience, inclusivity, and integrity could change the world, one workplace at a time. The decision was swift and uncompromising. Following a thorough internal review, the board of directors released an official statement. Richard Myers was dismissed from Titan Corp for unethical behavior, citing his discriminatory hiring practices and misuse of company resources. The once smug manager left the building under the watchful eyes of his colleagues, his head lowered and his reputation in tatters. For many employees, Richard's departure marked the end of an era, one defined by favoritism, exclusion, and fear. His downfall wasn't just a punishment, it was a turning point, a statement that Titan Corp would no longer tolerate toxic leadership or systemic biases. Naomi Carter stood in the conference room a week later, leading a meeting with her department heads. Gone were the stiff formalities and the tension that had once characterized these gatherings. Instead, The room was filled with open discussion, thoughtful collaboration, and an air of mutual respect. "Let's focus on actionable goals," Naomi said, her voice steady and inclusive. "We need hiring practices that prioritize diversity and equity. Let's ensure every candidate is evaluated on their skills, experience, and potential, not on superficial assumptions." Heads nodded around the table, her words resonating deeply. Naomi had made it clear from the start. Her leadership style was about building bridges, not walls. She had already implemented a mentorship program to support underrepresented employees and created anonymous channels for reporting workplace concerns. "It's not just about what we achieve," she added, "but how we achieve it. Success means nothing if it's built on exclusion." Naomi's efforts began to ripple through the company. Employees noticed the difference almost immediately. Meetings were more collaborative, hiring processes more transparent, and new initiatives celebrated a variety of voices and perspectives. One employee, a junior analyst named Marcus, shared his experience during a team meeting. "This is the first time I've felt like my ideas are actually being heard," he said. "It's empowering." Even those who had once aligned themselves with Richard found themselves inspired by Naomi's leadership. "She's shown us what true leadership looks like," said Claire Roberts, a senior manager. "It's about integrity, fairness, and lifting others up." Naomi's quiet determination had transformed not just her department, but the culture of Titan Corp as a whole. Late one evening, Naomi sat alone in her office, the soft glow of her desk lamp illuminating the room. The day's tasks were complete, and the building had grown quiet, but Naomi lingered, taking a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the challenges she had faced, from Richard's dismissive behavior during her interview to the doubts and biases she had encountered throughout her career. Each hurdle had been painful, but each had also strengthened her resolve. Naomi's gaze drifted to the small nameplate on her desk. Naomi Carter, Vice President of Operations. The words gleamed under the light, a tangible reminder of how far she had come. Her thoughts turned to the future, not just her own, but the future she was helping to build for others. She envisioned a workplace where talent and effort mattered more than appearances, where every voice was valued, and where people like her could thrive without fear of being underestimated. As Naomi stood and gathered her belongings, she felt a quiet sense of triumph. She didn't need fanfare or recognition. Her victory was in the lives she was impacting and the changes she was making. She stepped out of her office and into the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors. The building was still, but Naomi could feel the energy of transformation taking root. A culture of fairness, respect, and possibility. With her head held high and a small, determined smile on her lips, Naomi Carter walked forward, ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead. Naomi's story is a powerful reminder of how resilience and integrity can dismantle prejudice and drive meaningful change. If her journey inspired you, share this story to spark conversations about diversity and inclusivity in the workplace. Let's work together to build environments where every voice is valued and everyone has a chance to thrive. Change starts with us. Be the difference today.